Glad you're with us for 11 Alive at 5. Today's show is going to be a little bit different. We got together, we talked, and we all feel like it really has to be. Two phrases have been going through my mind as I've had trouble sleeping the last couple nights. The one, overcome evil with good, and then what Mr. Rogers would always say, find the helpers, because honestly, everything right now feels a little helpless. I've heard a lot of people saying that after two mass shootings in less than 24 hours, 3 in 1 week, if you think back to Gilroy, California, at the family festival there. So a lot of families destroyed. Children are gone, some orphaned, a country fighting about what can or should be done about it all. So we're going to talk about it all because honestly, everything feels pretty small in comparison today. So we have seen helpers already. We're going to talk about some great examples of love when it feels like there's a lot of hate around us. We're going to talk about how we can cover the tragedies most responsibly and with the most sensitivity. And we're going to answer a lot of your questions about that. How have the victims' families over the years asked us to handle this kind of coverage? And we really want to know what you have to say about all of it. What worries you? What do you feel like has to change? What helpers do you see? What solutions are out there? And are we missing anything? I'm Cheryl Preheim along with Caitlin Ross and Kristen Reed, who manages our digital engagement. So one of the shooters wrote extensively about his anti-immigration views and what he was going to do in El Paso online. So this is such an important conversation. Caitlin, you talked to someone who saw that manifesto before the shooting happened.
Before the shooting happened, and that's what scared me the most about this, was that this is actually normal. I looked up some FBI statistics, and according to their tracking of these types of crimes, 86% of all of these incidents have something written online about them in the days or even weeks before the shootings happen. In 59% of those cases, absolutely no one says anything back to them. So Cheryl, when you're talking about that feeling of helplessness, the man who I interviewed earlier said, I need to do something about this. I need to change. He's a cybersecurity expert who I've interviewed a lot in the past. And so he actually got together with some of his friends and started a company to focus on this specifically. They drag what's called the dark web every single day looking for these threats because he said, I have to do something.
Wow.
We just felt like we had to. We're afraid to go to church. We're afraid to go to the grocery store. We're afraid to drop our kids off at school. And if we had any way that we could make a change, we had to.
And he really speaks to that feeling that we were talking about earlier in the newsroom, that I feel like I need to do something. You feel so helpless in these situations. And so he saw a space that he could step up and use his expertise to do something to change it. Incredibly, his team has already stopped a couple incidents so far this year. And he said there's, tons of man hours and expertise that go into it. But even if they can only stop one, it's worth their time.
Yeah. Kristen, you spend all day looking at what happens online. There is so much content and so few eyes to go through it all.
Yeah, we really struggle on the 11 Alive Facebook page and especially our YouTube channel, mining through everything, because even on stories that are sensitive or they may not be sensitive, the internet is full of memes, the internet is full of GIFs, people spewing hate at each other.
Yeah.
And we have these community standards on our different social media platforms. So it's really our job to make sure that no one is being attacked, to make sure that violent images that just are too much are taken down. But it's a lot. It's a lot to handle because you post 10 times a day, 20 times a day, and there's thousands of comments to go through. The internet is really hard to manage.
Well, that's the thing. There's so much information out there. And so there is a flip side to that coin. It's not that I didn't just speak with Patrick Kelly. I spoke with a former U.S. attorney who worked with the FBI and says that this is a difficult line to balance. How much do you monitor what's going on and how much do you censor what's going on? So listen to what he had to say about that really tricky balance beam.
Now that person is being investigated, questions are being asked of their friends, family, maybe at their job, and it's having real world impacts about something they haven't taken any affirmative steps at. So there's a tension there, a desire to catch the next mass shooter or cyber criminal, or whoever you want to catch, while at the same time not casting a net in such a way that you cast and wrap up and intrude upon the lives and sometimes ruin the lives of innocent people.
Yeah.
His concerns there are privacy, and those are valid as well. And I think we all struggle with that as journalists when we post something and you see all of those comments and you have to decide what's free speech, what are people allowed to say, and where does it cross the line where this is hateful, I'm not going to allow this to stand.
Yeah. Another thing we're having to really decide is how do we cover these mass shootings? We get a lot of questions about that. I'd love to see what specific questions you all have about it. Make sure to comment below, because we should get questions about the decision-making process. We want to make sure that everyone knows that the practices, though, for covering these shootings are really different for every single newsroom, so we can only speak to what we do. But Susan asked us today, 11 Alive, why do you post the evil, wicked person's name and their picture way before the names and faces of the innocent victims are announced? Why give this person any media coverage? Really, really fair question. And my first reaction was a lot of times that's the first name we get. And we wait to get the families' names and victims' names oftentimes, or we may have them and choose not to put them out there because we want to make sure that all of their loved ones are hearing it from a different place. They should not turn on the news and find out the worst moment of their life like in that way. So that's one thought I had. But talk a little bit about, we talk about this at length all the time when this happens. And unfortunately, it's starting to happen. It happens more and more. We're having these conversations more and more.
Yeah, and in our editorial meeting this morning, we had a long conversation about what conversations we're seeing other people have and what they're expecting of us. To answer our viewers' question, it is because sometimes that's the first bit of information we have. And one of the questions we get is, well, who did this? Like, you want to know as a human, who did this? And what do we know about this person? And that helps us in our minds try to figure out, well, the why they did it. And holding off the victims' names is a courtesy sometimes. Sometimes we just don't know because we're relying on police to release information because we never want to release a wrong name or wrong information. And sometimes when we rush to do that,
right,
that's where we end up.
And I think I've been on these scenes a lot where you do have that information, but it really is a matter of respect. You're waiting to make sure that families are notified properly by authorities before you tweet about it or put something out on Facebook. It just feels really disrespectful to me. So I think sometimes we do have that information, but we choose to wait until it's the appropriate moment and to make sure that families are aware of it. And you brought up a great point that people do want to know the motivation behind that. So even though you don't want to make these people famous, people do have a question about why did they do this? Who were they? Did I know these people? And Cheryl, I know you have really deep experience with covering tragedies like this, and the question of why release those names.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting. My very first year in television news, I was working in Denver, and it's when the Columbine shooting happened. And I had never experienced anything like that. And honestly, it was like the first time it felt like something to that degree had ever happened. I mean, at that point in our country, no one could believe it. You know, now we believe it. And we really were having like the first conversations about what do we do with this. And at one point we invited all the victims' families to come in to have a off-the-record private conversation. And we said, how do you want us to handle this? How can we best honor your kids? And many of the families whose children died inside that high school came, and I will never forget it. And I get choked up every time I think about it. But they said, please, please don't make these people famous. Please don't make these people famous, because forevermore people will think that is something to emulate, and we want our kids to be remembered. Please let their names be the ones to be remembered. And then, you know, whether it's the Aurora Theater shooting, all these other ones, that the zero notoriety conversation, which is don't use their names, and we've really grappled with that, especially if there's a court case, because they're in court. So, you know, to really limit the number of times we say a shooter's name and to focus as much as we can on the lives that were taken, but yet still understand what motivated that shooter, because if we can understand that, maybe we can get to the root of the issue and maybe stop the next one from happening. But it's all these really highly sensitive emotional balls in the air. But I do feel highly sensitive every time I hear a shooter's name, because I kind of like cringe, because I remember those parents saying, please don't let that be the famous one out of this horrible moment in our lives.
And years after these tragedies happen, the parents of the victims who I've spoken with say, let me tell you about my son.
Yes.
Let me tell you about my daughter. I don't want to focus on that person anymore. I want to remember my child. And I think that that is so often lost in these really heated, intense political discussions, is there are victims in this who were friends and neighbors and sons and daughters that have nothing to do with these political conversations.
Yeah.
And they never wanted to have anything to do with them.
And that's why the balance is so tough, because there are also those people who say that by not saying their name and by not naming the enemy, saying who's committing these crimes, that we're somehow hiding it.
Yeah.
Because as we acknowledged in our meeting today, there are a lot of domestic terrorists and people that create crime that do these crimes that don't look like the enemy that we always talk about.
Right.
And because we aren't saying their names, because we're not showing their pictures, there's a whole underbelly of people who feel like that's dishonest and feel like we're trying to hide something. So it's a tough balance.
And I think that's important because there is a stereotype in a lot of people's minds that does not match the reality of what we're seeing happen with the people who are perpetrating these mass shootings. And so we will show their picture, and we will be very careful about how many times we choose to say their name. So I had this moment at the library. You also, yesterday I'm at the library. The library in my town is like open for like 4 hours on Sunday, and we waited till the last minute. We had to get a few books before the start of the day. So I'm there with my 4 kids. My youngest is 3 and my oldest is going into 6th grade. And we're just getting library books, and I have this moment where I look at the door and then I look at the counter and I think, okay, we will go behind that counter if something goes wrong. And then I caught myself like, oh my gosh, like this is where my head space is right now as I'm holding a toddler and my other 3 kids are around me. And I had this like thought, like I can't live like that. I can't live in that kind of fear. I'm thinking about as the good stuff. And so I was like probably the annoying lady in the library, but I was like gonna talk to everyone. I was gonna thank the woman at the counter because I just kept thinking about Mr. Rogers. You know, I grew up with him, and like, look for the helpers, look for the good things, be a helper. And so I was really like, today I was really focusing on that. And so I was asking on Facebook, hey, if you have great stories of things you see around me, let us know. And I got a great comment from Kenny King, and he was talking about something we first talked about on 11 Live yesterday. He said, amidst all this horrific news of all the shootings this weekend, I shared an article from 11live.com about the soldier from Georgia who helped protect the children in El Paso. He said, I always try to look for and share stories of heroes during such times. I love this. I love that you're saying this, Kenny, because I totally agree. And he's talking about Private First Class Glendon Oakley, who was there at a Foot Locker. Some kids ran in, said there was a shooting happened, and this like soldier went into action, and he rounded up as many kids as he could to get out. And we had the chance to talk to him about that moment.
We run towards Dillard's, and it's like a playpen over there. And I just see a whole bunch of kids, like without their parents, just running around screaming, crying. So I grab as many as possible, and I try to get a couple other people to, grab other kids, but they're just so worried about themselves, they're gone. So I'm like, man, I'm thinking if I have a child, what I would want somebody else to do. So I just grabbed as many kids as possible, and I got out of the store.
There's something about hearing that just makes you feel better, because there are so many good people around us that want to do great things and want to do the right thing. And I want the megaphone to be as loud for them as all the other stuff you hear all the time, right?
I totally agree with you. It's so important to spotlight those stories. I listened to his interview and was just sobbing at what he had to say, and he got really choked up talking about it too, because he wanted to help. He wanted to be a helper. I also saw from Dayton, Ohio, 2 children who went to the crime scene with bouquets of flowers, and they were handing them to the police officers, saying thank you for protecting our community. And it's that we really want to spotlight.
No
hopefully that stuff
question.
sticks with us.
Yeah.
Like hopefully those are the memories we remember when we think about this or these shootings.
And it makes people look for ways to be able to do that.
Right.
Like to take some action. Heidi Wilson had a good comment here. It's sure an awful way for us to learn the lessons, but I'm consistently amazed, especially those that manage to find a greater purpose through their pain. And I'll tell you, nobody has been better examples of that to me as the families that are actually in the midst of this sometimes. Because, I don't know if you felt like this at all this weekend, but I wanted to sometimes just like put the phone away. I don't even want to know. I don't even want to know. And then I thought to myself, there are a lot of families out there right now that don't have a choice. That this is the reality. So I don't know. I say, like, let's do whatever we can to help each other out. What else can we do, right?
Yeah. Right, exactly. And I love to leave it with that message. Just do what you can to help other people and try and help each other out, because this is a really difficult time for everybody. I think whether you knew somebody or you're just watching from afar, it's hard and it hurts And I'm glad we're having these conversations.
Yeah, please keep your comments coming. We really want to hear what you say about all this. We appreciate you joining the conversation with us. We want to keep talking about this issue in the comment section of the video. You can also reach out to Kristen, Caitlin, and myself on our social media pages. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories, but for now we're leaving you with the hope that you'll be able to find a lot of helpers around you. Have a good day, everybody.